Guys, CES is right around the corner, and this means that we're gonna have a lot of news recently, and obviously I'm gonna try to do a recap if nobody else has done any interesting recaps, but you know, there might be a lot of people, especially Gamers Nexus, Digital Foundry, and other great channels are probably gonna do better recaps than me, so just look forward with a grain of salt that I might make some CES recaps. Now, what I'm most interested for this CES is looking at Intel with their new Rocket Lake. I'm hoping that Rocket Lake is actually good in terms of performance, that they're actually going to show some numbers, but they never really do, to be honest. Rocket Lake is pretty interesting because it's the first time that NVIDIA is actually dropping cores on their consumer platform. So originally they always had 4 cores and 8 threads on the high end, and they kind of dropped cores and threads all over the place in terms of i5s and i3s and Pentiums. Then a little later they started adding cores. This was around 2017. They started adding more cores onto the consumer platform, utterly nullifying the low end of the HEDT platforms, such as X99 and X299, which had just released. And so then we were at 8 cores for a little while, only really 1 generation, to be honest, and then they went with the big move. Last year they decided to go with 10 cores. So moving forward with that, they've decided that they were going to make Rocket Lake, and due to Rocket Lake's massive IPC gains, however, staying on the 14 nanometers, it seems as though they're not able to fit more cores. They're not going with a chiplet design, apparently. They're staying with the same amount of L3 cache, however, they're gaining on L1 and L2 cache, which is, you know, good for IPC. Overall, I believe that the 11900K is going to be an excellent contender against Ryzen 5000. Intel 10000 was already very competitive against some of Ryzen's competition. In terms of the low end, they were getting really good performance out of their mid-range, which at this point the mid-range is the 10700K and the 10600K. They're competing still well against some of the Ryzen processors, considering they didn't really have a mid-range other than the 5600K. Sorry, 5600X from the Ryzen, and on the high end they were still competing in terms of brute force versus the 5800X, although obviously Ryzen can have more cores through the 5900 and the 5950X. The way it seems as though Intel is actually competing against AMD this time over maybe a couple of years ago is not directly. It seems as though their HEDTs were powerful enough to hold off the Threadrippers in some tasks, and they were able to keep some of their consumers due to decent amounts of overclocking room and just some of the Intel inherent advantages that you have, such as Thunderbolt and other such technologies which AMD had been somewhat struggling to provide at decent prices. And so they're basically letting the X299 platform deal with that, and allowing the consumer platform and focusing on the consumer platform in terms of R&D at this point, and trying to defeat the lower end cores. Now, I think this is a pretty good move because AMD, I don't think I've talked about it on the channel, but you know, with my friends and overall I have talked about it a lot. AMD has a bad habit of making shitty motherboards. Okay, they don't make any of the motherboards, but it seems as though they have some licensing freedom, which causes the manufacturers to really cheap out on some of their motherboards. If you just look at the B550 and the kinds of support that they have, well, hell, there's only like 2 motherboards that actually have dual BIOS. I mean, dual BIOS, in my opinion, should be a standard at this point. It has existed for years. It's super useful. It allows for motherboards to not get bricked, and although there are some alternatives which are good enough for not breaking your motherboard, it's really, really useful, especially for an overclocker. Even an amateur such as myself knows that. Now, otherwise, due to the issues which the AMD platforms have, it seems as though Intel has been able to just keep steady with their motherboards and work with just making their, well, especially their platforms, just their price range and how they're perceived as the consumer, and they're just pushing on with the performance to compete against AMD. And in my opinion, I think they're winning, because I'm actually, like, a couple years ago, I was not enticed at all to go with Intel. I thought that the 7700K was kind of stupid. I thought that the 8700K was kind of stupid. I saw the 9700K. I was a little more impressed just because of the overclocking and the fact that it was 8 cores on the consumer platform, and it just had higher clock rates than Ryzen. But it was a bit of a long-term decision. I would probably go with 9th gen, just because of the better overclocking and the fact that they will get really cheap once the core war really starts up. And now that it has started up, and well, not just consumers, but manufacturers are working on making more than 10 cores on their platforms, I think that 9th gen makes sense finally. 10th gen on the 10900K doesn't quite make sense just yet. We'll have to see, but if it does get cheaper around the X299 range of prices, then it will probably make sense. But at this point, it doesn't quite make sense, as X299 allows to get you more cores for the same price, and with the faster L3 cache in a lot of games, it won't even actually perform better than X299, just because of the better L3 cache kind of helps with IPC a bit, and running around the same clock rates, around 4.8 to 5 gigahertz on the same architecture. I mean, you're not getting that much off of 10th gen. However, looking at this new release, seeing 11900K going a bit backwards in terms of core count and thread count, although in performance it will probably dominate, it is enticing me into buying a 10900K just because of that aspect. It seems as though I like CPUs and motherboards that juice out every bit of an architecture's limit, such as my FX8350. I bought this motherboard, specifically the Crosshair 5 Formula Z, because it really pushed boundaries in terms of VRMs, in terms of PCIe lane counts, and it still had some of the legacy stuff I wanted, such as PS2, PCI, and finally it had a Thunderbolt header on the motherboard, which was quite impressive. Now, I would have preferred, if they had ever come out with the rumored 10-core FX processor, I would have bought that in a heartbeat. That is really impressive. But I like companies that push their architectures to their limits, so that's probably what I'm going to purchase. I'm either going to get a 10900K 7960X on the X299, or potentially I'm going to buy a 9900K F or a 9700K F, anything in the F range of the 9th gen, and I'm going to try to basically BIOS hack Maximus 9 Apex, as they're very, very good motherboards even in 2021, especially because of that PCIe lane upgrade versus Z490 and Z390 even. So that's what I have to say for today, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed. This is just a little bit of a review of what we can expect, what we have as a meta in 2021 in terms of CPUs and motherboards. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and have a good day.